My Lords, I too would like to thank the Noble Baroness Anna Fuller for this debate or discussion. I share a lot of the concerns already raised, especially by the Noble Lord Forsyth of Drunclean, because I have a dread of mission creep. Also, like the Lord Hope of Craighead, I'm going to look at some of the specific wording in the code, because I've read it several times now, so I'm going to look at some things that worry me. One thing to just say, I would like to encourage one aim of the review, and that is to shorten the code. Because at present, it seems to me to be an overly complicated deluge of details in regard to rules that dangerously threaten to drown out those very general principles that we're so concerned about when it comes to standards. The very standards that the Noble Lord Evans has just indicated are so important. So you've got to be able to see them very clearly. And for me, the problem at present is that the rules are all that you can see. I also think that there's a danger of turning the code into a counterproductive box-ticking exercise if it is dominated by rules in this way. It means that you can feel virtuous if you obey the letter of the rules rather than believing anything of the spirit or having any feel for the spirit of the rules. And we've seen over recent weeks with the Glasses for Passes or Taylor Swift tickets saga and so on, that the we're acting according to the rules defence does not engender public trust, regardless of whether it was within the rules. But the main reason I wanted to speak today was because my particular interests and knowledge are in relation to how, in broader society, straightforward do's and don'ts about, for example, conflicts of interest professionally, have gradually seeped into the more subjective and intimate spheres of interpersonal relations and the problems that can create. The devil is often in the detail, and I will raise some problematic parts of the small print definitions of especially bullying and harassment later in my remarks. But there's actually an absence of detail in that part of the code that is mandatory for all noble lords. The code demands attendance at seminars designed to, and I quote, raise awareness of and to prevent bullying, harassment and sexual conduct. Yet there's no details about the contents of these compulsory sessions. How can we debate their effectiveness here without being able to scrutinise what they say? That's hardly transparent. And these compulsory seminars have created headlines in the last couple of years when various high-profile noble lords were disciplined, indeed named and shamed, for non-attendance. But I challenge the value of these courses per se. I do raise this with some trepidation because the implicit accusation lurks in the code that not taking these courses somehow infers that you aren't taking bullying or harassment seriously. Yet these sorts of training modules, ubiquitous throughout the public sector and notoriously of mixed quality, can be politically contentious, deploying the worst and divisive EDI stereotypes, for example, but also use insultingly patronising and hectoring tone. And worse, they act as a form of compelled speech. You have to nod along and give the correct answers to prove that you aren't guilty of harbouring some dodgy or malign attitudes. And why only compulsory seminars for these particular behaviours? Why not courses in financial propriety or the correct use of political donations? I'm not suggesting that, by the way, on the mission creep front. Yet somehow, bullying, harassment and sexual harassment are treated as especially grievous. The backdrop to some of my reservations to those parts of the code relating especially to bullying and harassment is the way that over the last 20 years or so, interpersonal relations in the workplace have become politicised, while conversely, the conflicts of public life, ordinary conflicts such as political disagreements, are being conducted in personal terms. Politics has become personal in the worst possible way. What's more, the accusation that a public figure has behaved inappropriately towards another person can exact a far greater price than any amount of corruption. That alone means it can be too easily weaponised. I first encountered this a couple of decades ago when I cut my teeth as a trade union rep at an FE college. Shortly after management added bullying to its disciplinary procedures, there was a spate of complaints. I represented 2 members of staff, one was accused by an incompetent fellow member of staff, another by a student who struggled academically. Both were, as it turns out, victims of false allegations and were eventually totally exonerated. But the process dragged on for months. At the end of it all, one of the accused took early retirement and after exemplary 30 years as a lecturer was left feeling bitter and betrayed. The other had a nervous breakdown. I learnt then that often the process is the punishment. I've tracked similar destructive ways that anti-bullying and harassment codes have spread in universities and how they are often used by activists to cancel speakers and hound and silence lecturers whose so-called toxic views are deemed as bullying by some students. Only recently, and closer to home, eventually, after many hellish months, the Equality and Human Rights Commission closed the case against the noble Baroness Faulkner of Margravine. She was being investigated because EHRC employees filed bullying complaints that seemed to have been ideologically motivated because of Baroness Faulkner's completely correct stance as chair of the EHRC in clarifying the protection of biological women's rights. So one reason I'd argue that we have such cases is because the charge of bullying can be used as a political weapon in a witch hunt to discredit opponents, because the definitions of bullying are so nebulous and subjective. In the Code's appendix, which details these definitions, this is even admitted, as it states, quote, bullying may be characterised as offensive behaviour that can make a person feel vulnerable, upset, undermined, etc. And we're told that, quote, whether conduct constitutes bullying will depend on the perception of the person experiencing the conduct. Perhaps less cynically, the data shows that once anti-bullying procedures are formalised by organisation, claims of victimisation inevitably grow and grow. That is hardly surprising. Perhaps increasing prevalence may be less a response to actual behaviour and more people's changing interpretation of that behaviour. And much of what's listed in the Code seems almost to be inciting complaints about minor incidents. So under bullying, we have being sarcastic. I mean, what? I've just done it. Using, quote, inappropriate nicknames and practical jokes. We're told bullying can be verbal or non-verbal, persistent or an isolated incident, can be manifestly obvious or hidden, insidious. That's a very wide brief. Can the committee explain how such vast parameters won't encourage trivial complaints? What procedures exist? Oh, yes.
I'm most grateful to the Noble Lady. I think I'm right in saying that in the case of bullying, the identity of the complainant is kept from the person being complained about, which makes this even more egregious.
It just gets worse and worse, is all I can say. I want to know what procedures exist or are going to exist in any review to avoid vexatious complaints, and how the use of accusations, either in pursuit of vendettas or due to simply misinterpreting harmless personality clashes, will be dealt with, and who decides what is actionable and using what criteria. Arguably, the definition of harassment in the Code is even more troubling. Harassment, we're told, can be intentional or unintentional, and again depends on perception. There are some extraordinary quotes, and I would urge my noble lords to read it because it's frightening. A person, I'm quoting now, a person may be harassed even if they were not the intended target. And the example that then made me gulp was, a person may be harassed by jokes about a religious group that they do not belong to. I mean, what on earth censorious identitarian doors does that open? Or there's, wait for it, deliberately, I don't know who decides deliberately, holding meetings or social events in a location that is not accessible for inclusion by reason of, for example, religious prohibition. So I get together in a bar, which some let's say, practising Muslims won't want to attend, could be seen as harassment. That's the word that's used. Or my final example, quoting the code again, the use of unacceptable and inappropriate language, again, who decides what's unacceptable or inappropriate, or racial or other stereotypes, regardless of whether the complainant is in fact a member of the group stereotyped. I mean, this is harassment. It insults those people who are victims of proper harassment to say that. But using a recent controversy, maybe I can claim harassment here because I heard one noble baroness call another member of the public a coconut, which I consider a racial slur. Well, it doesn't affect me, but I heard it. I'm harassed, am I? I'm certainly offended. But let me assure you, I don't need a code to say that. I'll just argue back instead. To conclude, I think it's a mistake to encourage people to police their conduct or their language using an ever-prescriptive code. If this code was to be taken literally, if anyone actually read it and then took it literally, or if it was to be heavily enforced, it would stifle frank and open debate and undermine us holding each other to account in public. 2 of the 7 knowable principles denoting standards in public life are openness and honesty. And what actually gives us the ability to be honest and open is not a bureaucratic code, but an unapologetic commitment to free speech. So I'm glad to see on page 6 of the code, and I hope this can stay and be highlighted even more, a recognition of the primary consideration of the principle of free speech in parliamentary proceedings to allow members to express their views fully and frankly. Well, hear to that. So I would ask how all of us would feel then about a rather disappointing letter, not directly to do with the code, but a part of mission creep, I'd say. A disappointing letter that we were all sent by the chief whips across all the parties, in which we were asked to mind our language. At the start of the new term, 2nd of September, we got a letter where we were asked to ensure that, quote, debate does not descend into vitriol or use rhetoric designed to inflame or offend. I found that chilling. Perhaps because I wrote a book entitled I Find That Offensive. I know that attempts to purge so-called offensive speech can be a less than subtle code for telling people you can't say that. I want us to avoid reducing political rhetoric to carefully manicured, rehearsed lines from a sanitised script, and instead stand up for what we believe to be right with passion and plain speaking. And if that sounds vitriolic, so be it. And to be honest, there's so many challenges in national and international politics at present that deserve our vitriol, that maybe saying it out loud is the mark of an honourable public service, far more evident than following any code of conduct, which, broadly speaking, I would just cut and cut again.
Yeah.